possibly increase jobs in Europe, to keep quality jobs, to keep social standards, the European social model, to keep a very highest in the world environmental standard that we all want, and furthermore to transform to net zero in quite short terms, and then to provide for the European security and defense, which means to build very robust supply chains, because when it comes to defense, you cannot simply supplement a product produced in Europe with a Chinese import. You need a very, very solid and very trusted supply chain here, which is yet another condition. I have communicated, exchanged during the 5 last years much more with, let's say, heavy industry than financial circles. I still do so. And what I usually hear are two very simple expectations on behalf of the industry. They want money as much as possible, and as much deregulation as possible, most of them. Okay, fair enough. And then I listen to the policymakers' answer, for the moment, mainly the Commission. And answer is, there is no money. By the way, the 24 pages of the Clean Industrial Deal communication, I would summarize to there is no money. Then there are some other points as well. And since there is no money, at least we can deregulate as much as possible. We can offer you this one at a discount. But then what I hear from the financial sector, which obviously has to provide the missing public money here, is that they don't want so much deregulation. And at least they want a lot of data in what they're going to invest, which is obviously conflicting with the simplification agenda on reducing reporting as much as possible. So here is my conundrum, a dilemma that I have no answer to, and that's, as I said, why I'm so happy that you answered to this invitation, because I might find some further answers from now on. I'm thankful very much to my colleague Lara Wolters, much more proficient than myself in the subject that we are discussing, much more experience from the previous term, and that we have the Commission present, which is always very, very important to have. So I'm very much looking forward to listen to you in the next hour and something. Thank you. And who comes next?
Yes, thanks.
Here is the mic.
Much. Amazing. Thank you so much for these excellent introductory remarks, Mr. Kanev. And once again, thank you so much for having us here today. Also, good afternoon once again, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can also hear us well online. And thank you for taking time from your busy schedules to come here and discuss with us on this very important topic. My name is Aleksandra Palinska. I'm Executive Director of Eurosif. And I have the great pleasure of moderating an amazing, actually panel composed of, the representatives indeed of the European Commission. So we have Martin Merlin, the Director of Financial Markets at DG FISMA of the European Commission. Indeed, as already announced by Mr. Kanev, we have Lara Wolters, who has played a very instrumental role on some of the key EU sustainable finance rules, including Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. So thank you so much, Lara, for coming. We have Helena Viñes Fiestas, very well known, I think, to all of you, and who has been, playing an instrumental role on developing the EU taxonomy, but also, I would say, making suggestions for improvements to many other sustainable finance rules. And she has been now for the last 2 years, if I'm not mistaken, chairing the platform on sustainable finance. Well, Nathalie, you already know, our very well esteemed chair. We also have with us Elise Cachin, who's the head of tech and I think regulatory affairs at Nokia. And also we have Matt Christensen, who is the head of sustainable investments and impact investments at Allianz Global Investors, and who actually also happens to be sitting on our board. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining. So the plan actually for today is that we start with a panel discussion for around 40-45 minutes, and then I will open the floor to the questions from all of you. I think the intention is to make it a lively and interactive debate. I mean, as Mr. Kanev pointed out, I think he's here also to learn, and I think all of us are here to, I think, discuss and think together how we can really scale up investments for industrial decarbonization, growth, and competitiveness. So without further ado, let me, oh, yeah, sorry. There is also, I think, a couple of housekeeping announcements I'm supposed to make. So in case if you need to use the restroom, it's basically that way through the corridor straight and to the right. Later on during the Q&A session, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand and also introduce yourself. And also please try to speak up, because we have, unfortunately, only 2 little mics. So we need to basically ensure that everybody can hear as well. So, Martin, starting with you, could you maybe actually recall what has been the original aim and objectives of the EU Sustainable Finance Framework, including the EU Taxonomy, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards?
Yes, happy to do so, Alexandra. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation, Mr. Kanev. So as you know, the EU has set the bar very high in this area with bold climate targets. And to achieve these targets, we have been a global frontrunner with the development of our sustainable finance framework, most notably with the EU taxonomy and with an ambitious corporate sustainability disclosure framework. I want to say from the outset that the Commission remains determined to achieve the EU decarbonization goals. And we still firmly believe that the taxonomy, the CSDR, the CSRD, the SFDR, and also the CSDDD are the right instruments to boost sustainable investment and to green our economy, even if we have taken the view, like many others, that a certain amount of simplification was needed, and therefore we proposed some adjustments and recalibrations in the omnibus package, which we can discuss later. So to answer your question, Alexandra, we brought in our proposal for this framework in 2008 in response to what we perceive to be a clear market demand. Investors needed more information to guide their investments with a sustainable focus. And we recognized also that sustainability in itself gives a competitive advantage to our companies and to our economy. So therefore, we brought in an ambitious framework to help direct sustainable investment. The market needed a standardized framework to ensure that investors had the information that they needed in order to make informed decisions. So by being a first mover, we set the pace for progress on sustainability, and we established a high standard for others to follow. Some have followed, others not yet. But we also remain very firm on what we think is very important, namely the far-reaching double materiality perspective, which, as you know, measures both the sustainability risks that a company faces, but also the impacts that the company has on people and on the environment. And to be clear, we think that this perspective should be maintained. And you have seen that we have kept it in the omnibus package published on the 26th of February. So we need more investors to channel more financing to companies that help to address the sustainability crisis, rather than towards companies that may exacerbate the crisis. And that can only happen with better information about companies' impacts on people and on the environment. Better sustainability reporting will also reduce the risks of financial instability. I see a number of representatives of the financial sector here. The aggregation of multiple investments made without due regard to risks arising from issues such as climate change or biodiversity collapse can have systemic consequences. Therefore, we think it is key that companies are transparent about their sustainability-related financial risks. And the new rules, we think, should in the medium and long term benefit companies themselves. Mandatory common standards should substantially reduce the burden that comes from having to apply multiple inconsistent and overlapping sometimes standards. And we think that ultimately standardization is a means to simplify the rule book that needs to be applied by companies. We also think that the discipline of sustainability reporting should help companies to better manage their own sustainability performance and risks. It should provide analysis and data that boards and managers can use internally to decide on investments and to shape the company strategy. Just as boards use internally the financial information that is reported according to financial reporting rules. So we do think that in the medium and long term, the ESRS standard should help to reinforce the resilience and the competitiveness of European companies. And we are also seeing already positive results from the framework. Investors are identifying and capitalizing on green investment opportunities, and companies are better equipped to plan, measure, and track their environmental performance. So as a result, we see green investments growing, and we are confident that this trend will continue. Now, of course, as you know, many companies, many member states, many stakeholders have told us that some of the sustainability reporting requirements are too burdensome, and particularly smaller companies in the scope of the CSRD are struggling with applying the rules and with the costs that may be implied and also the resources that are needed. And therefore, there was a risk that these rules could hamper competitiveness and also make Europe less attractive for investment. This is why we have tabled the omnibus package recently, and we do hope that it strikes a reasonable balance between the need to continue and press ahead with our sustainability finance framework, whilst at the same time making sure that it doesn't hamper competitiveness. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for these very useful insights and reminding all of us actually also, the background to all of that. And maybe now I'm moving on to you, Lara. So what do you think? Does Omnibus strike the right balance? And could you maybe also explain how CSRD, ESRSs and CSDDD that have been adopted fit in the context of scaling up investments for industrial decarbonization and growth?
Happy to have a try. Thank you for having me, first of all. The short answer to that question, does it strike the right balance? As far as I'm concerned, is no. I think I'm not the only one in this room, but I am very happy that we can sit in this room and discuss that. And what I've been doing lately is attending discussions of a smaller format. And I find that it helps me in my energy levels at this difficult time in Parliament, because I have the feeling that a lot has changed here over the elections, and that if members of parliament keep shouting things to each other across in the plenary room, that we will never get anywhere. And it's not always easy to not do that, because I think that members of parliament represent groups of people that need to be heard and that need to be represented there. So I think that there's no way of not standing in plenary and saying things that can sometimes sound like sound bites, much to the frustration, of course, of those, you know, experts and those within a certain sector who think that, you know, what are we really talking about? But I think that the difficulty at the moment is that not enough of these discussions are being held with experts, with people truly wanting to bridge differences and think about things objectively, so to speak. There's always a political context, and I think that the European Commission has certainly fallen in a bit of a trap here as well. And I have started feeling a little bit sorry for Commission representatives needing to defend the omnibus package, because my sense is that the omnibus package has been very much created in a sort of top-down fashion by a very small group of people. And I think we all know who that group of people are, but with limited input from the outside world, and under a time pressure that was self-imposed, and I think, frankly, almost dangerous. I understand that politics is a place of PR sometimes, but taking decisions such as these, a radical change of course, and then justifying that things, for whatever reason, would need to happen in the first 100 days, I think that's senseless. And if we want to get things right, and if we want to do things right, then there is no reason for that rush. There's certainly no reason for within the first 100 days. And I'm very happy for people to take their media moment and stand on stages and do things with, what was it, the electricity grid with beautiful lights that I think we've all seen memes of. But we do need to stay sensible here. And I think there's a political discussion, but there's also a policy discussion that at the moment that needs to be deepened. And for me, Omnibus doesn't get it right, because there's obvious things that I think could be done that aren't being done, and then there's things that will actually set us back that are being done. And to just take one step back before we do that, because my colleague said that he came from more of a focus on heavy industry, and that heavy industry, I think, was concerned they wanted money and deregulation, and now because the Commission can't maybe offer one, it is trying to offer the other. I think what industry wants very much as well always is stability, is predictability and stability. And there, I don't think there is such a difference between the different sectors. And what I see happening is that the Draghi report that I think from left to right, everyone is interested in, is embracing, from what I see, is being misinterpreted somewhat, because I think that the messages that Mr. Draghi gives are messages that are somewhat more important than deregulation. And I think there are things like the national differences that come about when, in spite of a European law, national legislation is being transposed, or European legislation is being transposed. I think that's unhelpful. I think there's energy prices that are mentioned. There's finding skilled people next to the right industries, making sure that we've got that pool and that people don't leave. And then, of course, there's other things as the very, very important 800 billion a year question of financing. But my sense is that because all those things are complicated and all those things are political questions that require time and long sessions between leaders in council, that we're not so much focused on those, but that we are doing, or that the European Commission is doing what is within its power. And so perhaps our sense or our analysis of that is a little bit the same. I think that if you see the past 5 years and the legislation that was made around the Green Deal, perhaps you could say that too much was being done in too short a time, or that here and there's overlap and some things have been overdone. But if you zoom out, then perhaps you could say that that would not be such a problem now if at national level there had been the leadership required for these to just be flanking measures. And I think that the European Commission very laudably sometimes has stepped into a leadership vacuum trying to do what's right. when it comes to the Green Deal, sustainability and our future. But if it isn't then backed up by member states that are providing the money, the infrastructure, the conditions of a true single market that are needed, then it's the Commission that gets put under pressure to change course. And I think that an ideal Commission would say no to that and not change course so radically. But then again, an ideal Commission, of course, would be able to instill on national leaders more of a sense of leadership. Maybe that's a very long-winded way of saying I think a lot of people understand what's going on now, but that doesn't have to make it right. And for me, Omnibus doesn't get it right. I think for CSRD, yes, there's issue around an over-interpretation perhaps of materiality, or a sense that we need to have belts and braces to make sure that nothing gets underreported. But I think that there at level 2, a lot could have been done that wasn't necessarily at level 1. I think just slashing companies out of it, saying that companies now aren't allowed, so those who need to report, to ask for certain information won't make the information out there more usable. The idea, and as you sketched, of course, was the usability of the information, the granularity of it, the comparability, and all of that. I think if now information is no longer so accurate, then aren't we starting to embark on something that is more of a paper pushing exercise than what it's supposed to be? It's an open question, but I don't think that this is very useful. I also think that things like digitization, clarifications that aren't maybe politically radical enough in this day and age, but could have really done much more than skeptics, have told, I think, some of the Commission to do. Either way, I'll leave it there for now. I have a lot more to say on both of these files, but I think that's enough for me for now.
Thank you, Lara. Now turning over to you, Helena. So what is your view of the Omnibus proposal, and what do you think we need to really scale up investments, for industrial decarbonization actually, and close the 800 billion per year funding gap?
Thank you, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. The first thing I want to share with everyone is that we sometimes forget that the European financial markets, it's an ESG predominantly market. 62% of the market in terms of assets under management are, have environmental, social, or governance characteristics, or a sustainable investment objective. So the reason behind it is because on one hand, the industry has been working for a long time, on that, but also because the European Sustainable Finance Package has been very successful. We've seen how in the last years, one of the the fastest growing assets has been, ESG across the board. We've seen how mainstream investors, banks have integrated ESG, throughout the investment decisions, the financing decisions, and everything. And it is a successful story. And we need to be very clear that, traditionally, the US financial markets have outperformed the Europeans, but it is in sustainable finance where we have a competitive advantage. We have become the sustainable finance hub in the world. Not only, there are 58 taxonomies in the making, all inspired on the EU taxonomy, but also the ESRS and not the ISSB, as some say, have inspired, not only the ISSB, but many disclosure regulations across the board. I welcome everyone to take a look at also all the policy development that's happening outside of Europe, outside of the US, to look at what's going on in Asia, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Japan, and you would see how many of these policies are being developed or have been developed and implemented. So yes, we have the leadership, we are leading, but it's not for granted that we are going to keep it. So the first question that we should ask ourselves is, do we want to maintain the leadership when it comes to sustainable finance? Yes or no? Yeah. The second point I wanted to make is that the overall goal of the sustainable finance package, besides, fighting greenwashing, which was seen as something that we really needed to overcome because it was identified as the main challenge for the mobilizing capital flows to sustainable investment. So besides the fact that we do need to protect investors, that is a clear message. And with my supervisor hat on, I would say it is a priority. The reality is that, we needed that in order to mobilize capital flow. So the question is, well, has it been successful or not? And you mentioned our report that I would love to talk a little bit more about it, about mobilizing, how much we have mobilized. But the reality is that in only 2 years, with only a partial taxonomy, only looking at climate, we have already mobilized 530 billion in mainly climate mitigation, the main sectors, electric utilities, car makers, real estate, and a little bit on adaptation. I think that's for another discussion, but we should look at that point, more closely. Then, when you look at transition finance, besides the taxonomy, only last year, to the 250 years that a billion that the taxonomy mobilized, and this is only, taking into account the largest publicly listed companies in Europe are roughly 1,700. We can add 200 billion more in relation to, companies that have invested their capex, that have a credible transition plan. So we're starting to see the numbers between the first year and the second year. We've seen a 34% of investments growth in terms of capex. So it has been successful. That doesn't mean that we have not also identified the many challenges that we face, that what we needs to be changed in the taxonomy, what it needs to change, in the different pieces of regulation of the sustainable finance package. But the thing here is that we cannot throw the baby with the bathwater, And this requires, yes, simplification. Yes, we need to strike the right balance between the company's needs, the investors' needs, but also the investment needs in terms of, financing the transition. But that simplification needs to be done through the lenses of evidence and through the lenses of what we really know and the technical, sort of filter. And with that lenses, what I personally believe is that, cutting down on the scope of 80% is actually, of little help, that it will be much, much more useful to take the ESRS that we have already and say, okay, for the large companies, what are the indicators? Really reduce, but take the key indicators that the large companies need to disclose, not only for financial market participants, but also for them to transition. Because let's be honest here, what is costly is not to report, is to implement, the management systems, is to monitor, to calculate. And reporting and calculating is just the first step for the actually doing something about it, So we need to do that for the large companies. And then, yes, it's really good that I really support the Commission's creation of this mid-caps category. I think it is fair. But instead of excluding them, let's, reduce even further, even if it's a minimum, set of indicators, even if we give them more time to respond. But as part of the main, standard. Why? Because we need to think, you are a company, you have 1,000, workers, you have 449, turnover, or 49 million turnover 1 year. Next year, you need to change standard, go from voluntary, change your standard and start reporting. That's not really, very practical. 1 year, you do, next year you don't. And then the taxonomy, then 1 year you do, next year you don't. The work has been done. So why don't we have a full-on standard that is really comprehensive, that would allow that when they report voluntarily, at least they have a reference point, because that's one of the main problems, that we're going to face. If it's voluntary, companies are going to decide what, when, and how they report, and they will continue to report because the financial market participants will continue to ask, but at least let's have a reference point that they can use, in order to report. And then let's grow from there, But let's have only one overall standard that can work. I would really favor that. I think it will be much more practical. I think that is that we won't be able to reach net zero by 2050 if companies do not calculate their emissions, if there's certain things are not be done. That goes without saying. There are other indicators that they are, mandatory because of other policies. I think about gender and the gender. We do need, and you were mentioning it, that we have a real issue in fragmentation of the market, but it's not the EU regulation, I would argue, that fragments. It's the national, legislation. We see it on corporate governance, we see it on stewardship, we see it in so many ways. So why don't we start really standardizing, have that reference point, and then we work, from them.
Thank you, Helena. Now, turning over to Mont, I'm passing the mic. From the perspective as a global asset manager, what is your view and what do investors need in terms of the support, to help mobilize investments for sustainable growth?
Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. I already appreciate the different views that are being shared. I'm going to try to respond to some of what I've already heard. Let me start by saying simplification sounds great as an investor. We're happy to have that message. I appreciate what Helena has said, though, which is if we go too far, and also Madam Wolters, then are we just creating more chaos? And that's something that between the national and the EU side has been very difficult from an investor view. So I take umbrage in those comments of, is there a way to have a bit more consistency when we start to think about regulation, whether it be what we've just gone through or where we're going today? So in terms of the pragmatism, we definitely want the pragmatism. We have found that in general, we're getting used to the rules. It's been painful, but I would really like to be careful about how far we move away from it back to the Wild West. I started coming to the Commission 20 years ago talking about the need for data consistency. I feel like we're still saying that even today. We need to make sure we have that consistency in spite of where we might go with trying to find a way to simplify the regulation. So in terms of some of the thoughts, I want to come back to what Helena just said around the scope. We're comfortable with the scope being shifted. I think that's an interesting idea that you've said. I'd be happy to see it more at the 500 employee mark rather than the 250 employee mark. Maybe there's some scope to look at that if we're still looking for simplicity about messaging, about employee as one basis for it. But more important than the scope is just the breadth. It's just too much. Too much information was asked. Maybe it's this level 1, level 2. Maybe it was the idea of auditors saying you have to do everything. Otherwise, we're afraid of lawsuits. But there's been too much information that has been required. And I think that's the area that we really want to come back to and think through. How can it become a bit more comfort about the materiality of the information and thinking through something that is a bit more maybe led by the larger companies on a restricted area of criteria, but that specific criteria could continue to be standardized, available, historically relevant for us, and something that we can continue to use to inform our investment decisions, which we all agree this has helped us go somewhere that we were not before. This is the positive out of what's come out of all these different regulatory instruments. So data's been said, and we are concerned right now that if we move too far into the direction of Mr. Merlin, where you said that currently we're thinking about the trade-offs, we're worried about the data side. We're worried about that data moving back into voluntary world that we saw what that world was like. And we saw how much engagement activity we had to do as firms. The questions and discussions we had to ask was greater around basic levels of data. And I'm concerned that if we go too far into that direction, we've lost the competitive edge that we are developing as a region, and that we're giving too much confusion to the market and really difficulty for ourselves about how do we actually look at the companies and know how to make sense of the information in the same sector of different companies with the information that's coming to us. The other thing I'd like to say, the 800 billion number keeps coming up. So we are really big fans of trying to think through the other side of this story. One is the reporting, the data consistency. The other one is the financing. And I appreciate also the idea that I travel a lot for my work and I see taxonomy is being used as a reference. You're right about this. It is looked at. I was in Hong Kong, they asked about what's happening. Singapore, they have the Singapore taxonomy. So there's a role for the EU to keep that leadership while trying to strengthen and tighten a little bit of the pragmatism side of it. On the financing itself and the transition, we would love to see ways that we can have consistency on instruments. And so one of the areas that we're very involved in Allianz Global Investors, is on blended finance. We still don't have a way to do that consistently for the EU. But when you look at 4 trillion of market value that's been wiped out in 4 weeks in the United States, that money's a lot of it kind of coming to Europe right now. They're thinking Europe is undervalued. We should be running with that and taking that tailwind and going forward and thinking through consistency on the financing of the transition to move past the discussion we have to do, data, all the pieces about clarity of consistency and standardization, but on frameworks that would allow us to do blended instruments that are actually benefiting Europe, infrastructure, private market instruments. We would love to see that as part of the idea of that 800 billion, how to make that clear so that we know it's going to be there for a while and not something that can be turned over in 1 year or 2 years, because we make allocation decisions on 5 and 10-year horizons when we're looking at large scale deployment of capital. And this is an area that we've put now roughly 4 to 5 billion in blended finance instruments. We have over 550 billion as an asset manager, and roughly 65% of our EU retail funds are sustainable, Article 8, Article 9. So it's a commitment we have for the long term. We just want to make sure that we do not go backwards while we're seeking pragmatism into more confusion. Because that world, I remember, I've been in this field over 20 years, that was a harder world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. Now, turning over to you, Elise, from Nokia's perspective, what do real companies need to support their transition to a low carbon economy and track capital? And what can do you policymakers to help?
So first of all, thank you for having me today. And maybe taking a step back from the financing itself, for a company like Nokia, what is really important to understand as a starter is that competitiveness and sustainability go hand in hand. Right now, the story we hear is a bit of more of an opposition, but at the end of the day, as a company, we get assessed by our clients and customers whether we are sustainable, and if we are not, we just don't get the contract. And that, I think, should be the basis of that conversation. And because we need to deliver on that, the most important for us is to have an ecosystem that is supportive of the low carbon transition. And obviously, new policymakers have a key role to play here. So I would say more concretely, we would need 4 things. First of all, setting ambitious targets for climate targets for 2040, just because as stressed here, we need consistency, and we need to have predictability, and we need that renewed commitment of the EU. Second of all, we also need some environmental standards that are harmonized, transparent, and support the transition, but across supply chains and value chains, but also across industries. Why? Because every business is within another's business supply chain or value chain. So when it comes to the transition, you need to be able to have that interoperability. And really, we would like to invite the EU to really break silos when it comes to that, especially when it comes to reporting, data sharing, circularity. I'm thinking, for instance, for materials, waste treatment refurbishments, also energy consumption, sustainable finance, assurance. So all companies can work better with each other. And very concretely, it's because of such harmonized standardization approach that, for instance, as Nokia, we were able to issue sustainability-linked bonds because we used our STBI commitments as a KPI that spoke to everyone because we had that interoperability. And that brings me to my third point, which is also we need the EU to work with other regions. Just again, if we want European companies to scale up and be competitive at global scale, we need to make sure that whatever the EU does is actually speak to the rest of the world. So as you said, we keep that competitive edge in sustainable finance. And last but not least, a really important thing for us is about climate transition plans and making sure every business is encouraged and have an obligation to adopt and implement those. Why? Just because it creates an ecosystem and it becomes a domino effect where we are able to help each other a bit more easier on it. That being said, we also think it's really important to harmonize obligation around climate plans, transition plans, and really have a unique set of requirements under a common European template, and make sure that that template also protects sensitive business information, where we feel, for instance, project pipelines, which can indeed here be competitiveness issue. So I would say maybe from a really more concrete down the line, when you get the financing what you need, that would be it for now.
Great, thank you so much. And would you like also maybe just to very quickly react to the omnibus proposals?
Yes, so here obviously as a company we welcome the simplification in the sense that it's indeed a lot to comply with. For instance, we did our first CSRD reporting. We published it last week, and I will not surprise anyone saying it was a very huge ordeal. That being said, we do think that simplification should not come at the cost of the Green Deal objectives. So for us, it's really about making sure we are really targeted in the changes we make. I would also support MEP Wolters' comments on the question of CSDDD. It's not implemented yet, so it's also a bit hard to understand what we should be needed to simplify. That being said, for us, having clear guidance in due time is really essential. And making sure we protect the risk-based approach, which is currently the case in the text. And any conversation about T's and so on should just not put into question the risk-based approach. That help us be strategic about where we conduct due diligence. When it comes to CSRD here, anything we can do to have more relevant reporting points would be useful. So reducing the number. That being said, in terms of scope, and here I guess it's where we differ a bit, is as a large company, you have smaller companies in your value chain. So if you exclude them, how are you able to report? How are you able to conduct the due diligence, your own due diligence? So here it's the value chain cap is definitely an interesting idea, as long as it's also the simplification that is carried out to larger companies and reporting expectation actually match. In terms of timelines, again, for instance, as Nokia, we are part of wave 1 reporting, so stop the clock doesn't really matter to us. We will still be subject to that. So how can we make sure that first implementers are not penalized in that process would be quite important. And for taxonomy, obviously materiality threshold is welcome, since that it is the report. We would say maybe just go a bit further and ask the operational expenditure KPI to be made voluntary, just because it's a lot of reporting to do, and we don't feel investors really look at it as much from a company, real economy company standpoint.
Thank you. Now, as long as we're already, kind of also on the subject of transition plans and climate targets, which indeed is the essential one, Lara, would you like to maybe comment a bit on what has happened in terms of the omnibus proposals to the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive? I mean, what do you also think about the fact that, well, what is welcome is that the provision to set transition plans and climate targets has been retained. However, the obligation to implement them or put into effect has been removed. What do you think about that? And also, do you think that the changes to the due diligence requirements indeed seemingly shifting them away from the international standards and the risk-based approach? Do you think it's going to be a simplification or actually making life of large international companies harder?
Well, thank you for the question. I think where it comes to due diligence, the proposals, I mean, they make a mockery of due diligence, and I don't think anybody in their right mind who has deep knowledge on due diligence and current international standards on it would think that what's been put out by the Commission here is a good idea. In the broader sense, I think it makes a mockery of Europe because of our flip-flopping, but also when you look at our international position where others did look to us, and I hope they continue to do so, but I'm not sure, where others were following our standards and where we were set to be able to do that on due diligence, I think we shouldn't be surprised if if that's no longer the case in the future. On due diligence itself, I mean, the basics, the rug is being pulled from underneath the directive. What the biggest changes that are being made are on tier 1. So the directive that said you have a duty to conduct due diligence, but it's a duty that's, first of all, an obligation of effort, not a result. Secondly, it's one that's proportionate. You don't have to do absolutely everything. You need to do what makes sense, essentially. And then it's a risk-based approach that says you need to do what is important for human rights and the environment. You need to go and address risks that are material, so to speak, that are relevant to your supply chain, to where and how you do business, but you don't need to go and check and address absolutely everything, because that would just amount to paper pushing. If you are a textile company, then of course the risks that you need to address are going to be different from when you're a cocoa company making chocolate. But what this proposal does is it slashes all of that out, and it says, well, there is no proactivity anymore really for companies to look at their entire supply chain or value chain. No, instead, we just want companies to go and check their first-tier suppliers. If our true purpose here is to simplify things, then why on earth would we go and ask companies to do that? Because it's going to be extremely rare for European companies to go and find problems in their first tier. Now, I'm not saying that we don't have any problems in Europe, or that, you know, there's no social abuse going on, or that we don't have our own environmental issues, but generally speaking, we have legislated for that, and those would amount to criminal offenses and so forth. The idea in due diligence is that there's a proactive duty to go and conduct due diligence at the source, let's say. So very often problems, of course, occur in countries with fewer laws on social environment, or more flexible ones, or ones that are not being implemented, or and then closer to resources. So here the philosophy of this is completely wrong when we know what best practice is internationally, and that's because the Commission hasn't bothered, essentially. It hasn't tried. There was a time pressure that was much more political than it ought to have been, and this has been the result. But I don't think that it's sensible to go and ask companies to only look at that first tier, because that really is unnecessary red tape or paperwork. Then secondly, the liability regime. The whole difference with this directive was that if we are to create that level playing field for those companies who take their climate, sustainability, human rights obligations seriously, then they need to be backed by the legislation, and they need to have one over the cowboy companies that don't do these things and that don't take this seriously. If we now say, well, liability is going to be up to the member states, not only, of course, could you at some point in the future risk fragmentation, but basically what you say is, well, we say that this is a law, but essentially it's kind of voluntary, because nothing's going to happen if you don't do this. I find that a bizarre signal to give for companies that probably still feel they should do something with this. But then what you do when you do get those Chinese cowboy companies like Shein or others who say, well, if there's no real consequences, and let's be honest, I mean, the fines that could be imposed are sometimes more like pocket money for some of the biggest ones. Well, then why would you go and do this? And so these fundamentals are being pulled out of the directive. That, of course, absolutely is not simplification. That's just a way of elegantly binning the directive. And I don't know, if that's the case, how you would help companies by having this directive in this form in the first place. Same goes for the climate plans that you mentioned. If we do say in this directive that companies ought to have a climate plan that's in line with CSRD, then why do we ask them to do the paperwork of having that climate plan if we say that at the same time we're not asking you to implement it, we're not asking you to put it into effect? And all the companies present here, of course, will have followed the policy discussions. It's not like it's gone under the radar that the words putting into effect are now gone. So what signal does that give to companies? Again, I think that the changes as proposed, ironically, do the opposite of what ultimately is a laudable goal. I mean, just to start with that, I think everyone is truly in favor of simplification. I think everyone truly does want to look at, where has this gone overboard, or could things be done differently? I think on due diligence, one of the problems is that it was one of the last directives to have been made. And so I think it's a victim almost of sequencing, and it's a victim of a lot of fake news out there as well, because in due diligence itself also, of course, there is no extra reporting because the reporting is in CSRD. And then on CSRD, I think there, what could have been done really is to look at the data points, the amount of information. I'm very aware of the discussion of is this too much? I have a cousin who said, well, I was doing the CSRD reporting for a large supermarket chain, and at some point I felt like I was just copy pasting the narrative. I mean, we know these stories, and so let's look at what makes sense. And I think you can, as an intellectual exercise, think, well, if there's a policy that's required from a company, say on corruption, then is it useful to also be reporting on that policy? If the policy is there and is there to stay, if we don't say that should be removed, then how much added value is it reporting on it? And so those things I think you can, in good faith, do, and then you can draw your consequences. But again, what's being done now, I think, just misses the mark.
Thank you so much, Lara, for these strong and very insightful comments and observations. Indeed, actually, just yesterday, together with Merlin, we were also speaking actually at an event where there was a gentleman from Ferrero. It was a kind of a food-related event, but also on the omnibus. And I think it was very interesting because, being actually a very big company, but exactly he has been, strongly calling actually for ensuring that due diligence obligations remain close actually to the international standards and follow the risk-based approach. And himself, he was saying they're not going to be able to do the proper due diligence if they stay just on the tier one. With that, turning over to you again, Martin, and maybe slightly changing the topic. Today, the Commission is publishing the Savings and Investment Union communication. I would say how the Commission now plans to, make, yet another attempt at harmonizing the capital markets and also mobilize the needed finance for the industrial decarbonization, growth and competitiveness. And how does it link with the omnibus?
Yeah, no, thank you. So indeed, the Commission is adopting the strategy on savings and investment today. So you should be able to access the text now. I should say first that in that text, you will see no new announcements on sustainable finance, be it in one direction or in another direction. So the text is very much focused on deepening our capital markets and on making sure that savings go more towards productive investment in the EU, help growing the size, the depth, and the liquidity of our capital markets. And also we want to make sure that we inject more equity into the European economy, especially when it comes to small innovative companies, which often lack sufficient access to finance. So SIU is not strictly speaking about sustainable finance, but it should help if we are successful in making sure that there are more investments that are directed towards sustainable investment. If less money sits on bank accounts, if more money is channeled to productive investment, towards injecting equity into European companies, as I said, if we have more retail participation into capital markets, if we manage for those member states that think that this is appropriate, if we manage to develop funded pensions, well, all that should lead to more investments into the European economy. And naturally, a part of that will go towards sustainable investments, be it companies that are still subject to the CSRD, companies that will report under the VSME standard, or investment products that make ESG claims under the SFDR. So we do think that by growing the size of our capital markets, making sure that there is more productive investment, naturally, part of that will go to sustainability objectives.
Great. Thank you so much. Matt, before I open the floor for questions, could you maybe tell us, I would say from your perspective, how important transition plans and climate targets are, I would say from your perspective, analyzing the companies you're investing in.
Thank you.
And also, I know you're very big on impact investments. I think you already mentioned the importance, of blended finance, actually helping to scale that up. But yes, do you have, in addition to that, any further, I would say, wishes towards you policymakers in terms of how, further, I would say, unblock and I would say here and channel the investments for transition?
I'll share an example of what we're doing now as a firm on the private market side. So that's the unlisted side where ESG data is tricky to get. We have taken on a project to define what is energy transition across all the private market asset classes, because we think it'll do a service not just for our clients and for our investment teams, but equally for regulators. It was actually in Hong Kong where I was asked this in one of my discussions there, because I feel from what I hear that regulators are trying to figure out what's the best way for transition finance to start defining this, not just in public markets, not just through all the taxonomies, but also in the private market areas where we're trying to get capital to be put to use in rebuilding our economies or in decarbonizing our economies. Why am I saying that? Because the conversation we've had shows the complexity of this. You can have one area of investment that covers brown, transition, green, district heating, just an example. I think that this type of area where we could get some consistency over time, as I'm just representing one actor, well, I hear it's a common problem. You're still trying to understand this private markets, not public listed assets, but how to actually connect this to some of the existing taxonomies and other transition work that has been done. This is an area where we'd love to make sure that what seemed to us that the regulation as it was designed, the private market area, which we're trying to do a lot of work on building infrastructure, was left a little bit of, let's get to that later. It wasn't a primary focus. The assets are not as big, but they are very long-term. That's also why I want to raise it here in this forum. So that would be one area. The other one I would say about transition and climate plans, to answer your question more briefly, of course they're important to us. We've developed an entire methodology around it. When the regulation first started coming out, we had to do a lot of proxies to try to guess information because this data was not yet at CSRD level. So it was about how do we actually try to understand and make sense of this. So I think that transition plans and using PAIs, DNSH, all these different areas around how to do a discussion, an intelligent discussion on climate transition, on making realistic assumptions and being comfortable that it's not maybe going to go as fast as we all had hoped. I think that's sort of a bit what the elephant in the room has been. But let's be honest about it. Let's try to actually think about, well, what do we think is realistic? And these are very difficult trade-offs to make, but that's the kind of conversations we're having with our companies all the time. And what I think would be very helpful from what's called the EU regulatory bodies is to think about how to keep that mindset about 2050 and with these things that we're trying to do, but to ensure that we have what are pragmatic, realistic ways to continue to move forward that might have had to be a bit adjusted.
Thank you. And Helena, I know you also have some specific views on the capital markets and how maybe certain improvements could be also made to actually help maybe address some of the existing problems.
To the taxonomy, of course. So the first thing I would like to share with everyone is that this current mandate of the platform started 2 years ago. And when the Commission gave us the mandate, already 2 years ago said to us that one of the priorities of the platform would be to provide recommendations to the Commission on how to simplify the taxonomy and the package. So what we did for that, we decided to do two types of assessments, right? On one hand, we said, okay, let's look at what's happening on the ground and look at, through the lenses of the different stakeholders. So what we did is specific surveys through 7 different types of stakeholders, of course, corporates and investors, but we also look at public sector, SMEs, etc., right? And then the other piece of assessment that we did is start monitoring capital flow, saying, let's develop a methodology, and start seeing to what extent, the package is being successful and where is money flowing. So On the first one, the overall summary would be that the taxonomy is actually working on the ground. That doesn't say that, that doesn't mean that there are not many challenges, but overall it's working. I already said that 530 billion have been invested, that the taxonomy has also, we've seen also companies not only, you know, they're using the taxonomy to guide their investments, but equally when they think they cannot achieve that level of performance, what they do is they set targets, you know, also using the taxonomy as part of the transition plan. So it's been really interesting to see how on the ground it starts being happening, that link between the taxonomy and the transition plans. We've also seen very interesting some reports coming more and more from the sell side that starts seeing a correlation between the financial performance and taxonomy alignment performance. So that is starting to, you know, to materialize, which obviously goes to the critical point, which is the taxonomy is a tool to help companies access the finance they need and hopefully cheaper capital. I would also say that one thing that has been really successful has been the climate transition benchmarks. There are already almost 200 billion invested on that. And obviously the green bonds market, you know, continues to really boost, and Europe is leading on that. On the challenges, what we've seen is obviously they do no significant harm. It's clear that needs to be reviewed. I would say the main problem of do no significant harm has been for financial institutions, clearly, and credit institutions. That has to be changed, and we put forward really specific recommendations on that. But also for companies, what we need to understand is that it's very different from I am building something. So again, the CapEx story, right? I'm building a new plant. I'm doing a new investment, I as a company. So I use the taxonomy as my guide from the outset to how it needs to be applied from the outset, sorry. Yeah, that's easy. The problem is when I need to look backwards. Yeah, so what we need is to review the criteria and the Article 8 delegated act with the view of putting that difference on the different users and users, yeah? And then, of course, you know, there are some questions around interpretation, you know, and simplification, but all that has to go through the delegated acts, yeah? So we are very pleased to see how the Commission has decided that the reform or simplification of the taxonomy is going to go through level 2. You know, we are also very pleased to see that the majority of our recommendations have been put in place. We asked for a materiality threshold. You mentioned the OPEX. It's very interesting because on the OPEX, what we said is de facto, make it voluntary. But instead of saying OPEX is voluntary, reduce the concept of OPEX to R&D. Why? Because R&D is the only activity that is not captured by CapEx, it's captured by OPEX. And if something we really need to invest in for the transition is on R&D, we are working towards expanding the definitions and the types of research, not only applied research, but also to include basic research. So if a company wants to issue a green bond and it has the link with the taxonomy, it can ensure that it can even access, it can issue an EU green bond standard by adding those operational expenditures. But because it has a materiality threshold, we offer it to be 10%. The Commission has put 25%. In any case, how many companies you know that invest more than 10% on R&D, right? So it is voluntary de facto, and if it is 25%, even more, yeah? But the point is, and I go back to the same thing, we need to look farther than reporting. We need to look at the objective. What is the mean and why is it for, right? So OPEX for me is R&D, and in some cases for adaptation, but it's voluntary for the company to do it if they want to, yeah? In terms of the actually the monitoring of capital flows, I don't want to bore you, I'm conscious of time, but because we didn't have, I wanted to bring you this because this is from our report, yeah? This is 2023, yeah? You cannot see it, but I will pass it around if you're interested, yeah? So thanks to the taxonomy, thanks to transition plans and the information, now we can see, this is for the companies that report, we can really know how much money is going into very specific economic activities, per year, and through which financial instruments, how it's being financed, I mean, at a time where we have such a big investment gap, at a time where we need to really target, public funding, and we need to think what we want to incentivize and how. I mean, imagine if we had that for the entire economy, every year on year, also from the from companies, the primary market and secondary market, how much we could start talking about, personalized or tailored, policy for that. So my big, concern, I said it before, but my big concern is around the scope. I agree. Let's not change the scope. Let's just really reduce the number of indicators. Some for the large companies and others for the small companies. What I'm worried about also is about the consistency that the omnibus has created between the scope of CSRD and the scope of the taxonomy. I don't see any reason why the scope of the taxonomy should be any different from the scope of a CSRD. It's an inconsistency that, it's unnecessary. And also, with all the recommendations that they are there for simplifying the taxonomy, imagine how much more money we can really mobilize. Imagine how, because we did recognize the financial market participants are struggling to use the taxonomy. They're using it more for engagement and for, and to have those dialogues and actually to construct their portfolios. But, and the question is back to Matt, imagine that you don't have to worry about do no significant harm. You can use the estimates and you had the taxonomy for 50,000 companies. Would then you use it?
It's gotten better if I hear it that way.
Exactly. There you go. Right. So this is what we need to do. We need to really be pragmatic and we need to really foster what it is working, it's taken so long to work on. And on top of it, is giving us the leadership within the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Helena. I think this is a great way to conclude our panel and now finally open for the questions. I think indeed, as the known proverb says, we can't manage what we don't measure, right? So at the end of the day, and I think something that is often, forgotten in nowadays debates is that reporting is not for the sake of reporting, is to ensure that actually investors, both private and public, have the reliable and comparable data to make informed investment decisions, because otherwise we might not be necessarily knowing what we're investing in. So with that, any questions or comments from the room? Yes? But if you could just speak up and also introduce yourself.
Yes. Very nice to meet you all. My name is Daniele Ciatti from E3G. E3G is an independent climate change think tank, and we have been working on transition finance for the past few years. You might know us because our UK colleagues contributed to TPT, the Transition Plan Task Force. And my question was mostly on the simplification agenda. I am willing to go a bit more deep and understand very well and precisely how we can achieve simplification without touching the objectives of the Green Deal. And it seems that in this room, there's a lot of understanding and a lot of cohesion into reaching the climate targets. My question will go more specifically on the sectorial standards. In the omnibus proposals, the Commission has essentially proposed to drop the adoption of standards from the sector SRS that has been developing. And my question would be, do you foresee the chance that the work that EFRAG has done up until now would still be used in a non-authoritative way by the Commission to give guidance for companies? I wanted to speak about sector SRS mostly because, especially for banks and the insurance providers, I think the information that the sector SRS will go would allow them to essentially report less information, more material for investors, and focus specifically on these data points without having to look intensely to the set one of the SRS. So my question is mostly on if there is any chance to keep the good work that EFRAG has done so far and to use these standards even in a non-authoritative way.
I'll just maybe repeat it for our online participants. So a question from E3G on sectorial standards and whether there would be a possibility to actually somehow leverage on the work done by EFRAG already on the sectorial standards and use it in a form of non-authoritative guidance. So I think, Martin, this is for you.
Yeah, no, we indeed decided to drop the sectorial standards and keep only the sector agnostic standards, because it was considered that this was a simple way of delivering quite a significant degree of simplification. And this was a very strong demand from certain sectors. That said, we acknowledge the fact that the sectorial standards were meant to help companies implementing the whole framework, so we should not lose sight of that. And we do want EFRAG indeed to develop tools, instruments that can nevertheless help companies in applying the standards. So we will be working with EFRAG on that, so that they can deliver those tools in the absence of sectorial standards. And we in the Commission are also reflecting on technical assistance that could be provided through member states to companies that find it difficult to implement the standards. So we are very mindful of the fact that it's not only about making sure that we agree on the rules, but we need to make sure that there are practical ways to help companies implementing those standards. To some extent, the sectorial standards were meant to do that, but we do not forget that maybe there's a void that needs to be filled, and we will be working with EFRAG to make sure that we can help in that respect.
But then, just to add on from that, and this is from an outsider who clearly doesn't sit in any of the expert groups and who isn't part of EFRAG, but I fail to see the logic in that. And again, happy to be corrected by anyone in the room, but if there's sectoral standards that are supposed to be more tailored to specific sectors in order to help them apply the CSRD, and then because there's a political message that we need to be slashing rules, that gets removed, the underlying problem of how do sectors best apply CSRD is not taken away. And then your answer there was, and because we know that that demand essentially is still there, we're going to try to fill that gap again with something that was tailored for in the first place, that had been thought of. And so I don't understand. This to me seems such a waste of time and energy and resources to basically get back to what the conclusion at the end of the day, that these sectoral standards were a good idea in the first place.
But they could lead as well to more data points, which is something that the various sectors wanted to avoid. So we needed to find a balance between the two objectives.
But that is something that surely could have then been seen at level 2, and it wouldn't need to. You could still have the same political agenda now and say what needs to be done is it needs to be made clear which data points for which sectors are considered usually material. I mean, I think there always needs to be a degree of, but to clarify that, I don't think there's any obligation to then go and add. So it seems to me that, again, if a sensible discussion between people in the know could have been had instead of the political posturing, we would have gotten to the same goals much more quickly.
Okay, any further questions? Yes, Olaf.
Olaf Jones from Insurance Europe. Maybe I can give a bit of an answer on that before raising some other points. I think that we were one of the sectors that actually specifically asked for certainly a delay for a number of years on any work on new sector-specific data points. Because although we tried very hard to give the message that the focus should be entirely on implementing the current ESRS, which is already a very major task with many data points and actually a very big achievement, because I think, as was mentioned, I think what's already in place with CSRD, it is already, we've done a lot in Europe. And I think that it shouldn't be underestimated. And I think when I hear that Europe is no longer in the lead, if you compare what we're doing with the rest of the world, we have led them. The ISSB would not have done what they've done if it wasn't for Europe taking the lead. So I think we should take some credit for what's been achieved, and it has had an impact. But in terms of the ESRS sector-specific standard, we were just seeing a huge diversion of attention and expertise on new measures, constantly saying, what else do we need? And instead of focusing on what was there, no matter how much we said we should focus on implementation now, people kept getting distracted because we have this deadline. We have to produce this. It's in the legislation. So we found it very helpful to say we asked for a couple of years delay. So let's look at how the data is produced, how it's being used, and then we can consider when and if we need any sector-specific and for where. We thought for the insurance industry, we weren't sure at all we needed any sector, maybe for some others. But to give you an example, I think we had a 70-page document from FRAG looking at all the possible additional measures, and that was some of the frustration. So we really think that we need to look at what's being produced. We really think the CSRD is the cornerstone. I think we found that the taxonomy did a very good job in raising the attention and getting a huge amount of discussion and focus and triggering insurance companies, for example, to implement a filtering process for sustainability. We are finding generally that the taxonomy is not so useful for making investment decisions. We do think transition plans are really going to be key, and the data in CSRD. And the data in CSRD goes beyond transition climate. It also covers some other elements of sustainability. So we are very keen to make use of other companies' data. And we were very keen for the mandatory transition plans to stay. Because if every company has, well, certainly every large company has a transition plan, that's when you start seeing change. Now, whether that has to be just a plan or required to implement a plan, I think there's still a discussion going on. Having the plan and making that published via the CSRD will already be a massive change. If that's available for 8,000 to 10,000 companies in Europe, that is a huge progress. And we're very much looking forward to making use of that data.
I can see, I'm gonna, give you 1 minute to react to it, because I can see
Very
that,
quickly.
but indeed very quickly, because I hear that actually we have to leave the room at 2.
Okay.
And we still have Nathalie's concluding remarks, but okay, go ahead,
So
Helena.
very quickly on your last point, on the rest I'm fine, but on your last point, I would slightly disagree, because transition plan is what it says, a plan. So it's the expression of wishful thinking. Yeah, we've seen how many companies have changed their plans overnight and their targets with no apparent reason. But it's still very necessary and very important, the plan. But what it gives and what is really important for investors is where it is the substance, right? The teeth. What is it that is going to give me that reliability, that assurance that the company is really committing and is really serious about it? And you know what that is? It's the CapEx. And how you invest your money. It's how the companies invest their money. Is that CapEx invested together with the CapEx plan that is part of a financial planning, which is the core and probably the most important part of a transition plan, because that is what is really assuring me that the company is serious about and the direction of travel, but it gives you. And today, which indicators give you the direction of travel of CapEx? There are 2. Taxonomy alignment with the CapEx plan on one hand, including the targets for future, and on the other hand, the ESRS indicator of CapEx exposures to fossil fuels. Those are the 2 key points that are giving you the real nitty-gritty, and substance of a transition plan. So for me, yes, transition plans, but without CapEx, without the information of the CapEx and the CapEx plan, it remains wishful thinking.
Great, thank you so much. So over to you, Nathalie.
Yeah, I think now it's time to conclude. Only 2 minutes. That would be a challenge to summarize such a fruitful discussion. So I would like first to thank all the speakers today for their really fruitful contribution. To thank the host for hosting that event, because that's and making it happen. Trying to recap, I think sustainable finance framework have been very successful. The taxonomy has been very successful so far, and I can testify from the example I see in practice. Europe is the leader, the front runner, and this is really and being copied by ISS or inspiring ISSB other countries, and this is really an asset on which we should be capitalizing. Yes, simplification is welcome, but it shouldn't be at the expense of the Green Deal and shouldn't be throwing the baby with the water bath. basically because we are at a time where, and we see that with the Savings and Investment Union being issued today, European company, including the smaller company, really need more equity investments. And for that, we need the data. So the call is, rather than reducing the scope of company reporting or providing sustainable data, is looking into simplification in the areas of the different key indicators, or scaling the indicators based on the company's sizes, and not removing the substance of the CS-triple-D, particularly on the due diligence chain, but also on the implementation of transition plan. On that note, I hope we are still on time, and I would like to thank you, all of you, for your attention. And again, a warm thank you to all the speakers and the host.
Thank you. So just if you think your conversation.
Yes.